Well, hello. So in the best classic bait and switch formula, we were actually agile, and we decided to not necessarily talk about the future, but we would talk about the second part of the future, which is all about innovation, disruption, and transformation. Because I had amazing conversations throughout the day. I went to Jill earlier and said, we need to change the presentation. We need to make it more relevant for this audience. So we are going to talk about this. So if my friends can bring up the slides here, I want to take you on this crazy journey into the world of innovation and disruption and transformation, whenever my slides are coming. This is the moment where I start dancing on stage. All right, so we call this a little tongue-in-cheek disruption, and for a very simple reason. I want to start off with a quote. This quote is attributed to a gentleman called Jorge Paulo Lemann. Jorge Paulo Lemann is the co-founder of 3G Capital, one of the largest hedge funds in the world. They're based out of Brazil. And I give Jorge an incredible amount of credit, because in front of his colleagues, in front of running cameras, in front of journalists, he admitted at the Milken conference 2 years ago to the following. He said, "I'm a terrified dinosaur. I've been living in this cozy world of big brands, big volumes. Nothing changes very much, and you could just focus on being very efficient, and you'd be okay. And all of a sudden, we're being disrupted in all ways." And I've got the great privilege to talk to a lot of CEOs and C-suites and boards of large corporations. And quite frankly, when the doors are closed, of course, they will never ever tell you this in person. But when the doors are closed, they all admit to the same thing. They say, yes, this feels like what it is. And this whole thing about disruption is everywhere. This is Google search trend data for the word disruption. This is 12 years of data. And you see it's rising and rising and rising. And it peaked, of course, at the beginning of the pandemic. Got down a little bit, but it's keeping up there. So we got very obsessed with this idea around disruption about 10 years ago, mostly driven by our clients, because our clients came to us and said, Pascal, disruption is everywhere. I'm a vegetarian. If any vegetarians in the room, quick show of hands, any vegetarian friends. So you know, if you're a vegetarian, you eat a lot of tofu, which is a staple in the vegetarian cuisine, and I eat a lot of tofu. Tofu tastes like absolutely nothing. And then you put sauce on it, it tastes like the sauce. Disruption is the same thing. As a consultant, I love the word because I get to my clients and say, you get disrupted, and my client comes and says, take my money. It's amazing. But it really doesn't mean anything anymore. So we embarked on a journey to actually figure this out. And our journey started 4 years ago. And 4 years ago, we started interviewing more than 250 world-class leaders of organizations who actually have managed transformation successfully. And we asked them one simple question. We said, don't tell us the strategy, the big thinking, the models, the framework. I don't care. What I care about is I want to hear from you what you actually did. So we sat down with them and said, explain to us, what did you do? And as you can imagine, if you talk to a lot of people, you see patterns emerge. And those patterns I want to share with you today. But before we get there, as a kind of a meta, a zoomed out version of this, very quick question. Who likes to drive a fast car here? Yeah, of course, I grew up in Germany. I'm by definition, I have to like to drive a fast car. Who actually drives a fast car? Okay, it's always every once in a while I make this joke. I ask that people do you like to drive a fast car? And then they say, what do you drive? And they're like, well, a Buick. I'm like, yeah, that's not a fast car. But here's the thing. If you drive a fast car, you know the following problem. If you drive really fast, and I used to drive on the Nürburgring, as a hobby, as a kid, or as a young adult, this can happen. And if you're a fast car driver and you ever do a safety training, they teach you one thing. And this is really interesting. It's counterintuitive. Because what happens is if you get off track here and you see the tree coming at you, to avoid the tree, most people look at the tree. And every single time you look at the tree, you will hit the tree. Do a safety training. This happens all the time. They teach you to look at the gap. Because if you want to avoid the tree, you need to look at the gap. And what we learned in terms of disruption and transformation is that most of the stuff out there, I believe, makes us look at the tree. And what I want to show you is I want to show you the gap. And here's the good news. In summary, so if you sleep through the rest of my 30 minutes here, in summary, it's really not complicated. It is just really hard. So that being said, I want to present to you 5 insights we got. I go through some of them very quickly, not because they're not important, but because we have very limited time, and it will expand on a few others. We're also writing a book about this. This comes out early next year. So if you want to ever go that deep into this, by all means, look at the book. First one, And again, this is stuff we heard from 250 of the world's best people who have transformed CEOs, C-suites, VPs at companies. The first thing they all told us is, in one way, shape, or form, they said, we base all of our thinking, all of our methodologies, all of our work on first principles thinking. Now, first principles thinking is not new. This goes back 2,500 years ago. Aristotle said, first principles thinking is the first basis, arguing from the first basis from which a thing is known. In other words, you argue from the capital T truth upwards. And here's the thing, most of us don't do this. We argue by analog. We say something looks similar to something I've already seen, so I apply the same reasoning. First principles means I really understand what is fundamentally true about a situation and argue up from there. Much harder to do, much more energy inefficient for us to do. But every single individual we talked to operated some way, shape, or form of first principles thinking. There's essentially three ways you can do first principles thinking. A lot of this we already heard. One is inside out. What do you know to be fundamentally true about your business and your customer? And then you argue up from there. You heard earlier the idea that like nobody buys a power drill, you buy a hole in the wall. This is, by the way, not true if you happen to be a high-end power drill manufacturer, because then you actually buy the power drill because you want to own the power drill. That's inside out. So you argue from what do you know about your customer, your product, the market to be true. The other one you can do is outside in. What do you know about the market, the world to be true? You want to know what your customer looks like in 10 years? You know what your customer looks like in 10 years. They're already there. They're just younger. So you can look at them. What are they doing today? And then extrapolate from there. What are they going to do in the future? Or you look at the giga trends, like climate change, for example. And then the third one is parallel worlds, this idea that you go and say, what can I learn from an adjacent industry which I can apply to my own industry? One of our clients is a company called Grupo Breca out of Peru. It's a conglomerate. They own anything from fishing and mining to banking licenses and hospitality. They had a challenge with customer support in their banking unit. They went to the hospitality business and said, can we learn? What do we know to be true about service in the hospitality industry? And how can we apply this to banking? It's a very clever way to do this. So that's the first one. And I don't want to dwell too much on this. There's much more to, as said, there's much more to dig into. But I want to get us to kind of like the apex a little later. So first one, first principles thinking. Second one, every single one of them told us about processes. Not surprisingly, they told us about agility. And of course, we heard this a million times, right? Like agile processes, the idea that you live in a complex world where you can't actually fully describe the outcomes, so you need to find processes which work. And when you talk to people, why are you doing this? What are the benefits you get out of this? This is data from the State of Agile report. These are the benefits you reap from Agile: managing changing priorities, higher visibility, alignment, time to market, better productivity. We all know these things. This is like, if you're a manager, this is on the top of your list. This is all the things you want to have. Now, here's the challenge we have with agility, because you will sit there and say, like, of course we do Agile. Yes, you do Agile, but you do Agile only in your software unit. This is, again, State of Agility report. Across the organization, we tend to not deploy any of the Agile principles, other than in software. In software, we do it, because that's where it came from. The best companies we've seen, the companies which actually have managed to transition from one state to the next, to be successful, apply Agile principles across the whole organization. They are Agile to their core. And just to invoke the great Jeff Bezos, he said once, and I really like this quote, he said, doing things at high speed, which agility enables you to do, that's the best defense against the future. So this is number two, and again, this one you will probably sit there and are like, yeah, maybe like really think about, like, are you actually doing Agile across the organization? And now we're getting to the apex, and this is the one where I want to spend a little bit more time, because this is the really complex one. This is the idea of how do you actually deal with this tension between what we call the core and the edge. Very briefly to explain, the core of an organization, this is your current business. This is where you make all your money. And then you have the edge. The edge is the new stuff, the 2-year, 3-year, 4-year timeout thing, like where you go from selling something today to like it was e-commerce at one point. For many of us, it might be the metaverse eventually. Another way to think about this is the core of your organization is low risk. In the core of your organization, you know exactly what happens. You've got high visibility. You've been doing it for a long time. You've got good data. The edge is high risk. And that already points towards an interesting challenge you have here, like competing interests. Third one, and this is really important. You make all your money in the core, you make zero money in the edge. And that already creates the biggest tension of them all. And here's the thing. If you're thinking about the core, the way I like to think about the core, it's a bit like an aircraft carrier. Of course, this is a reference to Top Gun. If you haven't seen the new Top Gun, go watch it. It's amazing. Aircraft carrier. You set it in motion, it just moves, it plows through the world. It's unstoppable. But at the same time, it's also incredibly hard to maneuver. Like, you can't just turn it. And if you are optimizing, if you're working in the core, everything you do in the core is about, and you will know this, it's about being efficient, effective, and optimized. You squeeze out margin out of every single thing out of the core, and that's great. And then you look at the edge. So again, the edge is this like new stuff, the little projects you try out. You try out social selling on TikTok or whatever it is. And the edge, when you look at the efficiency, the effectiveness, and the optimization of the edge, none of this matters. It's the exact opposite. It's all about increasing your learning. And here's the biggest challenge you will have as a manager. Because on one hand, you will find yourself physically, I have clients like literally that tell me it's physically. On Monday morning, you're sitting in a meeting, and it's about revenue performance. It's about the core. And you talk about productivity, and you say, how do we minimize the variation and maximize the uniformity? How do we squeeze margin out? And then, the same day, you're just like, you grab your coffee mug, and you walk physically across the store, the hallway, and you will sit in a meeting where it's all about the edge, enabling performance, where it's now about the questions of the number of experiments and the insights you generated. It's the exact opposite. And I tell you, I teach at a bunch of business schools, including Haas Business School and IMD, et cetera. We don't teach this anyone. We teach nobody how to actually manage this tension in your head, because I think what we need to learn as managers, particularly if we're tasked with like running this, like how do we become ambidextrous? How do we become good with both things? How do we actually separate these things out? And I tell you, I had the great pleasure of interviewing Jeff Weiner, who was the CEO of LinkedIn, and we talked about the core and the edge at LinkedIn. And he said, this was on a stage, and we had like this long 2-hour conversation. He said, Pascal, the way I do this is we have Future Friday. And I said, what is Future Friday? And he said, let me show you my calendar. He showed me physically his calendar. He said, Monday to Thursday for me is all about the core. And Friday I walk into the office, and every single meeting, every single conversation, and every single thought I have is about the edge. He physically separated. He said, otherwise I can't do this. And granted, I think that's quite luxurious to spend a whole day thinking about the future and working on the edge. But you need to make space for it, because it's so hard. The ambidexterity is so incredibly hard. And that brings with us an interesting question, because I get this asked all the time. The companies come to me and say, okay, so Pascal, how do I set this up? How do I think about the core and the edge? And then you've got people who are standing on these beautiful stages, get invited by Jill to speak here, and they say, the core and the edge, you have to separate them. They need to be totally different entities. My dear friend John Hagel, who was at Deloitte Center for the Edge, he basically makes a very compelling argument saying you cannot do the same things in the same company. You actually need to physically separate them. New company. And then what you do is you grow the edge into a new core. It just grows eventually, because there's so much intrinsic problems you have. And then you have people who come on stage and say, what John said is total bollocks. That doesn't work. What you need to do is you need to actually have a membrane between the two. They need to be separated, but there isn't membrane function. Mary Barra over at GM did this when they acquired Cruise, the self-driving car company. She said, I need to integrate those companies, but I can't bring in Cruise into GM. It would kill it. But I can't also leave Cruise on its own, because that doesn't work for us. So what I'm going to do is I'm taking the CTO of GM, who had God knows, 30,000 people under him. And I'm making him the CEO of Cruise, because he becomes the membrane function. He knows how GM works, and now he's running Cruise, and we can integrate those two. And then you have a third camp of people who say, everything which has been said before is total crap, that doesn't work, you actually need to integrate them into itself. You need to fully integrate these companies, because otherwise nothing will ever happen. If I've learned anything in my life, and anything with our clients, I can tell you, none of them is right, none of them are wrong. What you need to figure out as a company is, who are you? What is your culture? How is your organizational setup? What's your history? To then figure out which of those three models, or a blend even, works best for you. That being said, we did find a few things which are really important in the setup. And they are universally applicable, regardless how you set up the core and the edge and the separation. They're universally applicable as to how do you actually figure out, how do you set up the edge? There's three things. First one is the question of how do you deal with risk and reward? Let me explain this. So we like to think about the world, and again, this is, of course, an oversimplification, I know that. But we like to think about the world in three models. One, you're operating in the core. You know that ultimately that business is declining. And it might decline over 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, but you know it's going down. And what you do is you play essentially defense. Because you want to play still in this market because you typically make a lot of money in this market. So it's a great market to be in. But you play defense. You don't invest a lot of money into this anymore. So this is sustaining businesses. Then you've got the second group, which is in the core. You know there's growth potential. It's not exponential growth potential. You know there's growth potential, so what you do is you start investing into this. This is where you do classic innovation, what Clayton Christensen once called sustaining innovation. So you make a product better. Classic example, you're Apple, you roll out the iPhone 12 and the iPhone 13 and the iPhone 14, and guess what next year comes? iPhone 15. And that's okay. You make a ton of money on your iPhone, so do it. Keep doing it. And then you have the oddball out. This is where you operate at the edges, where you try new things, and this is where you have potential to see disruptive innovation. You see exponential growth. This is where you have true disruption. So three types of businesses you want to think about. And the question I'm asking my clients all the time is, who are the right people? You heard referenced the getting the right people on the bus notion from good to great. So who are the right people? Who are the people who are in each pocket? And this is where it gets interesting to me. We like to think about this as, of course, a stereotype. But we like to think about people fall into three buckets: farmers, gatherers, and hunters. Farmers are the people who are exceptionally good at sustaining a business. They love looking after the crop. They love weeding out the weeds. They love watering the crop. Their whole concept, their whole brain is about how do I maximize my yield on the field. Now the the attribute of farmers is, at the end of the day, they want to sit on the veranda, see the sunset, drink a glass of lemonade, and not leave the farmstad. They just want to be on the farmstead. It's nice. It's nice and cozy. It's not risky. That's where they love to be. And then you've got gatherers. Gatherers are the ones who they're going out and grabbing the fruit from the trees which are outside of the farmstead. They go and pick the honey out of the honey hives. They love being outside and outdoorsy and doing these things. But at the same time, when the day comes to an end, they join the farmers. They want to sit around the fireplace, put their feet up, put some s'mores into the fire. Everything's fine. I sleep in my own bed. They're innovators. And then lastly, you've got hunters. Hunters is the crazy ones. I'm pretty sure many of you are hunters. You like the thrill of the hunt. You love going out there. You go for the woolly mammoth. You know very well that you might die. It's totally inside of the realm of possibilities. I'm a rock climber. Every day I go out on the rock. I'm very often solo. I'm I could die. But that's part of the journey. Do you love this? But here's the thing. If you're a hunter, you come back with the woolly mammoth if you survived. Right? And you bring back the woolly mammoth. You should drag them into the farmstead. And now you want to do two things. A, you want to be celebrated as a hero because you are one. And B, you get the biggest chunk of the meat because you goddamn hunted that woolly mammoth. And now here's the question I have for you. If you're a company, are you actually even attracting hunters? And what do you do in terms of when you have the hunters, are you incentivizing them right? Because this is a challenge. In many companies, and I've lived through this. I've seen colleagues of mine build billion-dollar businesses when I was at eBay. Did they get a $25 million bonus? No, of course not. They got the golden watch. So what does the hunter do? They quit. And they say, screw this, I'm going to build my own company. And I think it's a really interesting challenge because I think companies have an interesting challenge set up here, which is, are you actually getting the right people? Can you even get hunters? And if you get hunters, are you creating the space for them to be hunters? Related, by the way, is every once in a while I see companies doing this mistake where they take a farmer and the farmer performs really, really well. And then we go to the farmer and say, Joe, you're an amazing leader. You're incredible. I have got this amazing, super important edge project for you. And then I take the farmer and put them into a hunter position. And I guarantee you, the farmer gets ulcers at the end of the night. They don't like, I mean, seriously, they don't like the risk. So it's a really fascinating and really important question first to you to answer is like, in the setup, are you making sure that you put the right people in the right places? Which brings us to the number 2. So let's say you have the right people, you start your Edge project. My colleague over at Deloitte talked about this idea that you have to starve the Edge. And what he means by this is very simple. Large teams are incredibly good at solving problems. You have got an actual problem you can well define, like get a big team of people on it. They solve it for you, of course. Small teams are incredibly good at finding new problems to solve. And in an Edge project, you don't even know what the problem is quite yet. You have an inclination, you've got an idea. So what you need to do is you need to keep those teams really, really small for a simple reason. Because the bigger the team is, we know this, the social sciences are full of this. The bigger the team is, the more of those issues you have. You know, anything from like losses, process losses, getting the floor challenges, social loafing, yada, 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 yada. It's endless. So your small, like your Edge team has to be small, which is counterintuitive because sometimes companies say, this is so important for us. We want to have the best people with the best resources, and we give you all the resources you need. Don't do that. Starve the Edge, as John Hagel from Deloitte once said. And again, like just to evoke our friend Jeff Bezos, and I'm not the biggest Bezos fan, but he is a smart guy every once in a while. And he said, like, you know the 2-pizza rule, right? The 2-pizza rule is that. The idea that you say no team is larger than what I can feed with 2 pizzas for a reason. Because it forces your teams to be creative, to be agile, to be nimble, to make do with whatever limited resources they have. They become creative and they become an actual Edge team. Third one, and this is a really interesting one. So you find your hunters, you put them into a small team and you let them go wild. Now you need to give them control over the experience. And that is probably the hardest thing you can do because it's very counterintuitive. What I hear companies say all the time, and absolutely no disrespect for this company, but there's this concept which is called freedom within the framework or freedom within the system. Coca-Cola company does this. So you go to your team and you say, you can build a new business unit, that's amazing, or you can come up with a new project, but it needs to look like whatever we're doing today. Because clearly, you don't want to confuse the customer. You don't want to risk the brand. You know, like all kinds of, I see people nodding here, right? So it's like freedom within the system. The problem with freedom in the system is what everybody does is you build something which looks exactly like what was there before. This is no disrespect for Coca-Cola. It's an amazing company. It does tons of money. But this is what they call innovation. Every single product looks like Coca-Cola. It feels like Coca-Cola. Let me contrast this with one of my clients. PepsiCo. They have a new CEO. That CEO is a gentleman who has been raised through the ranks at PepsiCo. Incredibly entrepreneurial leader, Ramon. And Ramon went to his company and said, I give you full freedom. Do what you need to do, because we need to become more agile, we need to become more nimble, we need to become better. I want to have bigger growth opportunities, etc. We worked with this team. So PepsiCo owns a company called SodaStream. SodaStream makes carbonated water at home. If you own one of those things, particularly here in the United States, you know one of the biggest problems with SodaStream is that you need to replace those canisters. When they're empty, you need to go to a retail store. Typically, you go to like Bed Bath & Beyond or Target or something and exchange those canisters. Quite frankly, I own one of those things. It's a pain in the neck because you have to go to the store, exchange it. It's just unpleasant. So what does the SodaStream team do? SodaStream team says, we need to do this differently. So what do we do? Of course, I mean, it's a very obvious one. You say direct to consumer. Why don't we send you new canisters and you send us your old ones back and we refill them and everybody's happy? What would every normal company in PepsiCo's shoes do? Every normal company, in absolutely no disrespect, but every normal company would, the team would say, okay, great, so we go to our CTO and our CIO and we figure out how do we do direct to consumer, and we go to our consultancy on record, we pay them $2 million, they do a feasibility study, we get like that much PowerPoints. Seriously, I've seen it, like 800 slides of PowerPoints of which you look at the summary and nobody ever looks at the other ones. So $2 million later, then about $5 million later, you built an e-commerce store. 2 years later, you launch your e-commerce store to great fanfare, and it doesn't work. What does this team do? The team is empowered. Remember, Ramon went to them and said, you've got full freedom. Do what you need to do. What does this team do? They do the obvious. They say, wait a second, direct to consumer has been solved by all of you. So they start studying all your businesses. They say, let's buy a mattress on Casper. Let's buy, like some sunglasses from Warby Parker. Let's buy, whatever, like some jewelry from Pura Vida. So we buy some stuff and we look, what are these people actually doing? And they realize all of these companies, not all, many of these companies are running on a software called Shopify. So what does this team do? This takes them, by the way, 2 weeks. 2 weeks into the project, the team says, everybody runs on Shopify, so why don't we use Shopify? So they go to the Shopify site, use their corporate credit card, buy the most expensive version of Shopify, which I think, by the way, they overpay. $299 later, 4 weeks later, they launch their direct-to-consumer site. To this day, all of PepsiCo's direct-to-consumer business runs through Shopify. That is what you do when you give people freedom of, power. It's crazy. I sat down with the chief strategy officer at PepsiCo and said, you overpay. And he's like, what do you mean? And I was like, I can literally save you 60% of your expenditure. And he's like, oh my God, tell me. I was like, you could get away with the $79 package. You don't use any of those features. And he's like, Pascal, really? Like, seriously? This is what we are talking about? Anyway, so the question becomes, how do you manage the tension? Fourth one, leadership. Of course, leadership. And in leadership, we found 5 interesting insights, which are counterintuitive. They're different than what you normally see. One is your ability to commit. And the story I like to tell you is a story of a friend of mine. This is Maurice Conti, who used to run innovation at Telefonica Alpha, the moonshot factory of the telecoms company. And he talks about disruptors as cowboy. And the story goes like this. The C-suite of a company goes to the cinema. They watch a cowboy movie, a Western. And they're like, oh my God, this is amazing. We need cowboys. Cowboys are the coolest thing in the world. They will change our culture. We need to get some cowboys. So what does the C-suite do? They go and hire a bunch of cowboys. And the cowboys arrive, and they give the cowboys a whole floor in the building. And the cowboys do their cowboy thing, and everybody's happy, and cowboys are there. And a week into this, the C-suite goes down to this cowboy floor and says, hey, cowboys, we love you. You're amazing. Like, everybody in the company started talking cowboy speak. We are all saying, yeehaw. It's incredible. But here's the problem with you guys. You ride horses. And the cowboys look at them and they're like, of course we ride horses. What are you talking about? We're cowboys. And they're like, well, horses, they poop everywhere. They're smelly. Like, could we upgrade them to probably trucks? Would that be okay? And the C-suite, the cowboys look at each other and say, well, we're cowboys. We should ride horses, but whatever. It's okay. Can we get at least Ford F-150s? So C-suite buys them Ford F-150s. A week later, they're all driving around with the Ford F-150s doing their cowboy thing. HR comes down to the cowboys and says, hey, cowboys, you guys are amazing, and thank you so much for being so accommodating. You're amazing. You're so good for the company. But you run around with guns, right? And the cowboys are like, of course, we're cowboys. What do you think? And they're like, well, this is an HR violation. You know this, right? Code number 14 and the handbook. You can't do that. And the cowboys are like, well, we're cowboys. And HR is like, well, could you use plastic toy guns? And the cowboys are like, oh, Jesus, we're cowboys, but we want to do the right thing. So, okay, we get cowboy toy guns. And this, of course, goes on and on and on. And within a few months, all you have left is a whole bunch of old white dudes wearing cowboy hats and pretending to be cowboys. And the reason why I'm telling you that story is because in many, many, many companies, I've seen innovation projects work exactly like this. You want cowboys, but you don't want what they're doing. And you need to commit to them doing their cowboy thing. And the best companies, again, we get cowboys, and it's okay, they're going to be messy. They ride horses, they run around with their guns. So be clear about what you're getting. So commit to the outcome. Second one, the leaders we talked with, they all are good at what we call unknowing. The question of how do you lead into and in the unknown. That's a really interesting challenge, because you as a leader, your people will come to you and say, Pascal, where do we go? What's the future? What do we do tomorrow? And you will sit there. If you're faithful and truthful, you say, I don't know, because nobody knows what the future will look like. This whole metaverse thing, nobody knows what it will be. So we need to figure it out together. But as a leader, you need to be able to do that. And most leaders can't, because your whole career, your whole projection, trajectory in your career was based on this idea that you got promoted for knowing the answer. I'm very quickly looking at Jill. I see my timer running on me. Can I get a few minutes? You're the best. Third one, inverting. So this is about this idea that Our companies still run like this. Like we build our companies like this idea of command and control, the military system. You know, like the org chart is the outburst of that. The leader tells their subordinates what to do. The subordinates tell their subordinates, and it goes down and down and down. And then we expect the people at the bottom of the org chart just to execute. That doesn't work anymore. That never worked. Like the idea that you could say, like, you know, like here's how you do things in an environment which changes so quickly just doesn't work. The best companies invert this. They say, I'm actually not giving you the strategy. I don't tell you what you have to do. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give you the direction. I tell you where is the North Star, where do we need to head? And then I let you figure out how to get there. And I use you, in the meantime, I use you as a sensor because, as we heard earlier on the stage here, you are talking to the customer. You are seeing all the problems. You know what's actually happening, so give me the information back. The old way of the world was like you get your strategy right. The new way of thinking is really getting the direction right. What is my North Star? Where do I actually need to go? And then the old one was, again, like this idea that you could linearly execute. Like you have this idea that there is a 5-year plan you can execute against. The new way is what my friend Corey Ford calls, it's the drunken walk of the entrepreneur. You give the direction and you allow the organization to sway left and right, adopt to the environment all the time, dynamically. But you get to the point, you get to that direction. Second to last one in the leadership side, your ability to communicate. This here is not communication. Most CEOs think that this is communication, right? They show up a slide and they're like, look at everybody, like we all are aligned, right? Like you clearly get what is necessary. Always like a 2x2 matrix, it's like super inspiring. Let me do a quick experiment with you. I want to show you a very short video. It takes a minute. It has no sound. All I want you to do is lean back, watch the video. It's a really old video. And then you tell me what you saw, because I want to land a point here for you. So this is a video. Again, 1 minute. Just watch it and tell me what you saw. All right. If I could ask the table here, one of you, what did you see? Just describe what you saw. Yeah. Be brave. There's no right or wrong, by the way.
Okay. It's a little metaphorical.
Yeah, please.
One triangle keeping it going into its box.
Yeah.
The other triangle out, kind of like bossing it around.
Yeah. Bossing people around, like one thing, like moving into the box, bossing around. Okay. Some conflict. Yeah. Interesting.
Chaos happened.
So breaking in. Yeah.
The box, like one of the triangles, I've lost track of
Yep.
the original triangle in the box or not, breaks apart the box and it's broken. I don't know.
Okay, so there's like conflict, breaking into the box apart. Curious, like my friend, you were so engaged. What did you see?
So also a lot of conflict.
Yeah, a lot of conflict. Wow, okay, organizations being destroyed because of all the conflict. So this is what is called the Haider-Simmel experiment. It was originally done in 1943, has been repeated thousands of times around the world. By basically showing people like you this video and asking them, what do you see? Here's the interesting thing. You hear, and I've heard, we've done this many times, and you heard many, many, many stories. Anything from like conflict, very often conflict. I hear domestic conflict. I hear children fighting with each other. I hear animals playing. What I very rarely hear, and this is consistent around the world, is about 5% of people who are watching this right now, they will say, I saw a bunch of random objects moving through space. Like a couple of like triangles just moving. And that gets us to an interesting point. And this is the important point about the Heider-Simmel experiment. We think in story. You're hardwired for story. You can't not think about story. It's impossible for you. And as a leader, you've got two options, two important things to do. One is you need to communicate in story because people, this is the only thing you hear. You see conflict, not triangles. You see stories when I show you PowerPoint slides with like charts on them. And as a leader, you've got a choice. You can tell that story, or your people will make up that story for themselves. So it's incredibly important, like that we start telling stories. There's a reason why, like the moon landing was not like, and here's the ROI of us going to the moon and, like 5-year return on whatever. It's like, and by the end of this decade, we together put a man on the moon and so on, right? It's about narrative. Lisa Krohn once said, like, story evolved as a way to explore our own minds and the minds of others as a sort of a dress rehearsal for the future. Super important. You have to communicate in story. It's the only way humans communicate. The only way. Like if I show you a slide like we saw earlier this morning, we saw slides about the economy. You didn't see a slide. You didn't see numbers. You made up a story about the economy. In your head, you were like, oh my God, like this will mean like I have a closed store on my sign or whatever it is, right? Last one, persistence. Every once in a while, I get leaders who come to me and say, oh, this is great. This whole like transformation thing is a journey. It has a beginning and an end. Of course it's not. It's continuous. It's endless. More importantly, it takes time. We know that every startup, every overnight success, you all know this, you build companies. They take 7 to 10 years. Like every overnight success you read in the paper is all like 10 years in the making. Problem is, the Fortune 500 CEOs, the average tenure is about 5 years and it's declining. More importantly, the average tenure of a high potential in your organization is 2 years. And then you move them onto another project for good reason. So what happens to that project? Of course, the next high potential comes into this edge project, the thing which is really important, it's your future. And what does the high potential do? They say, oh, I need to leave my mark, so I'm going to change everything. Like we need to become persistent. We need to actually follow those things through. Last one here, upskilling. And I'm done, like just give me 2 minutes. Upskilling. So you play tennis. You learn how to play tennis. It's a game which you play in a court. You play like with a ball and a racket. And now the game changed. It's still a game which is played with a ball somehow, with a racket, but now it's cricket. And you now need to relearn the rules of the game, but also your muscle memory. It requires a very different like art of motion. And the question when it comes to reskilling and upskilling your workforce is twofold. The one is, and this is really important, relevancy. What is it your people actually need to know? And this is not you going and buying a LinkedIn learning subscription and giving it to everybody. All they will learn is how to play the guitar, if they learn anything. But this is like, we learned this again, like from the best CEOs, they sit down and say, for me, it is the role of the CEO to determine what the skills of the future for my organization are. It's not HR, it's our role as leaders. And then the second one is the question of scale. How do you scale learning to the edges? Because typically what we do is we invite people like myself and we speak to the VPs and then we hope that through osmosis, it will just trickle down in the organization. Of course, that never happens. So figure out how do you actually get this to everyone in your organization. Last one, just as a comment, there are no maps. Like, of course, everybody presents you maps, including myself, right? I show you a map. But please, 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 do yourself a favor and apply what I showed you and what everybody else shows you and apply it to your situation. Think for yourself. First principles thinking, because on every map, there's always dragons. So be careful. All right. If you want to stay in touch, send a blank email to this email address. If you add that number, 22727, which is of course today's date, to the subject line, it will send you automatically in the email my slides. So we have a little bot like AI for the win. But here's the thing, we also share, we add you to an exclusive list of like our clients where we share our latest research. So every Monday you get like a short email from us, here's our latest research, here's the stuff we're learning, here's the stuff we're reading. So by all means, be our guest, because I think any learning journey can only start here on stage. This cannot be the end. This is only the beginning. With that being said, I'm at the end. I'm over time. I'm super sorry. Jill will kill me, and I wish you all a super great time. I'll be here all day tomorrow, so if you have any questions, I'm around. Thank you.